At 6:47 on March 24, 1945, the sky above Nagoya burned a thin sheet of gray that hid the rising sun, yet let metal glint in a way that no one on the ground expected. Captain James Carter tightened his leather gloves inside the cramped cockpit of his P-51 Mustang and tasted stale coffee and oil on the back of his tongue. He squinted through the plexiglass and adjusted the oxygen mask strap with a practiced motion. On the radio, the voice from base sounded steady yet taut. "Red Flight, this is Control. 10 miles east of the factory corridor. Report." James's eyes cut to the horizon and saw a silver line where doctrine said nothing could be. Men in the observation posts below murmured numbers that did not add up. How had fighters reached a point that maps called safe? No one in the radio room had an answer at first. The sight was small and precise, yet impossible, the sort of moment that rewired how people thought about distance and safety. It was not just an aircraft in the sky, it was evidence that someone had changed the arithmetic of war. To understand why nerves tightened in barracks and command rooms that morning, one had to know a simple rule of the air at the time. Greater range came at a cost. Extra fuel meant more weight, which meant less maneuverability, less rate of climb, and often less armament. Escort doctrine leaned on this calculus. Fighters were shields for bombers within corridors of known reach, and when a fighter left its support, it gambled with every ounce of fuel it carried. For Japanese soldiers deep in the homeland, those rules were comforting. They believed that long inland raids would be the domain of slow, lumbering reconnaissance, or of bombers that could be tracked and intercepted. The Mustangs that crossed their skies combined a new heart with a clean wing and external tanks that could be jettisoned when battle began. That design mix made the impossible routine and sent panic down to the trenches and telephone poles. How had a plane that looked like an escort appeared over the capital with the confidence of a local patrol? That question would force commanders to relearn reach and risk. James was not alone in that silver morning. Around him, Flight Officer Samuel Ortiz checked instruments and muttered, "Fuel looks rich, but the wind is odd." Mechanic Eddie Morales had stayed up late fitting a new propeller governor and had watched the takeoff with grease still under his nails. Major Robert Hayes in the operations room tapped a pencil against a map and thought of bomber corridors that would now be vulnerable. On the Japanese side, Lieutenant Kenji Sato peered through a slit in a barracks wall and tasted dust and fear. Sergeant Hiro Tanaka whispered to Corporal Yuji Nakawara as they tracked a silhouette against the sun. Radar operator Alan Fisher at a coastal post watched blips crawl and then leap.
Those names threaded the day like beads on a cord of tension. Each man reacted with a professional reflex and a human heartbeat. The first contacts were a tangle of sounds and light. Radios crackled with numbers shouted then swallowed. The roar of P-51 engines climbed from basso rumble to a bright metallic scream as pilots pushed throttles. James and Samuel exchanged words that smelled of caffeine and adrenaline. "Form up tight," James said. "We will not let them break the box." "Copy," Samuel answered, close enough to hear the set strap creak. The enemy did not behave like expected targets. They dove and recovered with a calm that betrayed engineering, not luck. "They run clean angles," Samuel said. "Their roll rate is different," James replied, and felt the Mustang respond as if eager. Below the factory district, workers paused and looked up. The shock on faces in the streets was human and immediate, and inside cockpits, the technical shock was private and electric. The backstory of Captain James Carter began long before the scrubbed fields and radios he now relied on. He had been the son of a toolmaker in Dayton who learned to strip a crankshaft before he learned algebra. As a boy, he had watched biplanes at county meets and memorized the whine of radial engines in the same way a musician memorizes intervals. When the war came, he had lied about his age to join the local militia and found himself in a training class where cadets learned to read clouds like maps. Flight school taught him to trust instruments and instinct in equal measure, and a crash during a low-level training sortie had taught him how thin the line was between competence and catastrophe. He had lost his younger brother in 1942, a name that still snagged in his throat at odd hours, and that loss had driven him to the cockpit with a blunt hunger. That grief made risk clearer and sharper. He carried a faded photograph taped under his map case of a laughing boy in overalls, and he would touch the corner of that photograph every time his Mustang rolled into a steep bank. In base mess halls, he listened to mechanics and aviators alike and learned the language of maintenance and of men. The hour before the sortie, he had argued with Major Hayes about fuel strategy and had won the right to take 2 external tanks, in part because of that photograph, and in part because he believed that endurance could be bought with careful trade-offs. That belief would be tested when the sky decided to break the old arithmetic. The doctrine that made the morning confusing had been taught in classroom and hangar across both hemispheres. Engineers recommended that fighters carry only the fuel needed for a safe radius plus a margin. The logic was simple: weight, cost, and return probability. The P-51 Mustang altered that equation.
By bringing together 2 technical innovations that mattered deeply to pilots and tacticians. First, the adoption of the Packard-built Merlin engine changed the power band at high altitude, giving the Mustang an ability to sustain speed and to climb faster than many contemporaries. Second, the laminar flow wing design reduced drag and cruise, which made long transits less costly in fuel consumption. The addition of external fuel tanks provided ferry range and, when jettisoned during combat, returned the aircraft to a light and acrobatic configuration. Put the numbers plainly, the Mustang could ferry in excess of 1,000 miles with drop tanks and could extend combat endurance enough to escort heavy bombers across previously protected corridors. In 2 sentences, the math rewired fear. More fuel without crippling loss of performance. Commanders who trusted distance as defense found their assumptions shrinking. Detection and first encounters unfolded as a knot of small, decisive moments. At a radar station near Nagoya, Alan Fisher saw tracks converge, and he radioed Commander Thomas Blake. Unidentified intercept course, 11 o'clock high, multiple contacts, estimated range 120 miles. Blake hissed back, "Scramble local fighters and alert anti-aircraft batteries." On the airfield, Samuel Ortiz climbed into his Mustang and laughed nervously. "This feels wrong, like a ghost meeting a ghost." Eddie Morales slapped the wing and said, "Bring her back whole, Jimmy, or you will have my head." James moved the stick with the quiet of someone who had tied his grief into discipline and took them up. In the sky, the first exchange of fire was a study in contrasts. The intruders used speed to make brief stabs and then peeled away with a reserve of fuel that allowed them to climb back into position. James saw tracers pass and felt the Mustang shudder. "Sharp at 10, Samuel warned. He is high and coming fast." "I see him," James said, and rolled into an intercept. Voices aboard other Mustangs crackled in numbers and names, and the sense of shared calculation kept pilots focused even as fear circulated. On the ground, Sato and Tanakaka counted each blast like a knell. Civilians ran for shelter, and some soldiers prayed without ceremony. The battlefield had become a ledger of performance and of human reaction. 3 moments of tension defined the morning with a clarity that left memory like glass. The first was when James's Mustang took a hit that started an oil smell in the cockpit and a jitter in the gauges. He felt fabric and leather heat under his gloves and heard Samuel shout, "You are leaking." James answered, "Stay with me, I will nurse her." And that exchange stretched into a long minute of careful handling as he feathered the throttle and trimmed to keep altitude while keeping the enemy in sight. On the ground, the men who watched biography into the sky held their breath, and no one moved for a full 2 minutes, the length of an eternity. The second moment was when a formation of escorting fighters had to choose between chasing an intruder who led them toward a city or staying with the bombers 5 miles back. Major Hayes barked, "Protect the bombers," while Lieutenant Ortiz argued, "We can cut them off now." The choice was raw, the strategic cost immediate, and the temper of the pilots frayed.
The third moment was a mechanical decision more than a human one, when James finally pulled the lever and released the external tank. The tank fell away and the Mustang breathed like a freed animal. He felt the aircraft answer with a faster roll rate and a cleaner bite into turns, and he whispered, "Now," then went after his mark. Each of those moments felt monumental in the cockpit and in command rooms alike, and together they turned a campaign idea into a tactile experience. The combat itself read like a lesson in performance envelopes. Pilots measured angles of attack and energy budgets as if tallying coins. The Mustang climbed hard, then dove into an attack, making a steep boom, and then used a high-speed pass to avoid flak. Ammunition counted like seconds, and when rounds found a target, there was a visceral result, a wing folding or an engine coughing black smoke. On one pass, Samuel let loose a string of bursts and said, "3 hits, right engine smoking." James replied, "Push home," and then watched as a rival aircraft trailed smoke and then went into a slow roll and dropped out of view. Below, the factory chimneys belched, and men ran between buildings trying to find shrapnel and fear. Japanese soldiers named Kenji and Hiro kept eyes on the sky and on radios, and each sounded like a man who had learned to make the improbable palpable. The psychological impact on those who saw Mustangs at low altitude was immediate. Witness accounts later recalled screams and desertions and the sense that the homeland was accessible. A concise technical explanation helped officers at headquarters sort cause from effect. The Packard-built Merlin engine produced reliable horsepower at higher altitudes, allowing the Mustang to maintain speed where many Japanese fighters lost power. The laminar flow wing reduced cruise drag by a measurable margin, and external fuel tanks extended ferry range into the domain of long-reach missions. Combined, the package gave superior high-altitude escort capability without sacrificing dogfight agility once tanks were dropped. That process of matching an efficient engine, a clean wing, and auxiliary tanks was simple in description and complex in consequence. It let escort fighters cross previously safe corridors and required defenders to restructure patrol lines and anti-aircraft coverage. Moments of human reaction layered over the technical narrative. On the ground, Yukiko, a seamstress who had come to the market early, stood under a shop awning and wept into a handkerchief because she had never imagined front lines could slice her mourning. Commander Thomas Blake filed a report that night and wrote, "The intruders demonstrated sustained reach and aggressiveness not seen in previous raids. We must assume improved logistics or new tactics." Major Hayes spoke to mechanics and to strategy officers and said, "We have to adapt our doctrine. The maps are wrong now." Eddie Morales collected a charred fragment of aluminum and thought about the plane and the man who had flown it, and then took that fragment to his toolbox as if it were a talisman. The small acts of men and women like these stitched the strategic analysis to the human ledger. 3 tension scenes later in the day illustrated the broader consequences. A group of reserve troops hearing of raids refused to board trucks that they believed would take them into open fields where Mustangs could find them. A factory manager named Koji Mori argued with military police about continuing production and was met with silence and uncertainty. At the airbase, flight logs recorded pilots returning with evidence of engagements far beyond prior ranges. And intelligence officer Margaret Lyle sat with maps plotting lines that once looked like safety, now showing gaps. These scenes were pockets of social strain and adjustment that extended the battlefield into political and economic spheres. The immediate aftermath was a flood of reports and a reorientation of strategy. Commanders reviewed escort plans and anti-aircraft deployment. Statisticians began to chart sortie success rates and attrition curves. News of Mustangs operating at unexpected ranges percolated into the ranks of Japanese soldiers and civilians, and the psychological effect outpaced the material cost. Stories circulated of entire platoons refusing to occupy exposed positions, and of coastal villages seeing aircraft and assuming invasion in the hours that followed. On the Allied side, commanders realized that the Mustang was not merely a fighter, but a tool that could project power differently. The shift would alter raid planning, bomber protection, and even target selection for months to come. 1 month after the raid, changes were concrete. At the weekly operations meeting, Major Hayes presented a new set of route plans and a chart that showed escort corridors extended and layered with off-route traps. Eddie Morales had become a leader among mechanics, training crews on how to jettison tanks and service Merlin engines in the field, and his name appeared in dispatches as a nod to practical improvisation. In Nagoya, the municipal council convened emergency sessions to move critical production underground and to distribute new instructions on blackout procedures. Lieutenant Kenji Sato and Sergeant Hiro Tanaka were reassigned to coastal defense units where they trained to expect fast in-and-out attacks. Socially, the mood had shifted from stoic endurance to a nervous mobilization. Soldiers who had once trusted distance as a shield now kept their eyes on the sky and on the schedules of aerodromes. A minute of silence for a lost sense of safety. That month also saw a rise in patrol flights and an increase in anti-aircraft alert states. The Mustang had redefined where risk.
Lay and governments adjusted resources accordingly. 3 months later, institutional learning had started to accumulate. Intelligence bureaus on both sides had published assessments that described the Mustang not merely as a plane, but as a capability. Training manuals changed. Tactical tables included sections on fuel management and on dynamic escort that emphasized jettison and re-engagement. Corporal Yuji Nakamura, who had watched from below, now taught new recruits about recognition and deception, and his lectures included practical guidance to use natural cover and to move positions unpredictably. Aircraft factories that had assumed safety because of range now installed vents and shields and undertook efforts to camouflage supply lines and rails that could be targeted by long-reach fighters. On the Allied side, a small policy shift allocated more P-51s to escort roles and to long-range patrols. Pilots wrote home about a sense of agency when Mustangs roamed, and mechanics like Eddie wrote to their families with small triumphs about machines kept running. The psychological map had shifted from distance to presence, and both sides adapted in ways that were expensive and slow. 6 months after the events, the strategic landscape had altered significantly, and the epilogue was concrete. Major Robert Hayes had been promoted and assigned to a planning staff where he helped draft new escort doctrines that integrated the lessons of extended range and jettison tactics. Commander Thomas Blake oversaw a program to deploy additional radar nodes and to reorganize fighter rotation. On the Japanese side, supply lines had been rerouted and a new inland reserve system created to absorb surprise attacks. Casualty charts reflected both material loss and the cost of disrupted production that had to be rebuilt. Veterans who had been present during the March raid, including Lieutenant Kenji Sato and Sergeant Hiro Tanaka, attended a closed conference where they gave testimony about morale and situational awareness. And those oral histories later informed training manuals. Civil society adapted too. Cities instituted blackout drills and underground factories expanded capacity, while families like that of Yukiko adjusted daily routines to the new expectation of low-altitude overflights. In the aggregate, the Mustang had become a strategic lever, a psychological instrument, and a design case study. Its combination of engine efficiency, aerodynamics, and auxiliary fuel changed assumptions and forced a reallocation of assets. The reflection at the end of those 6 months was sobering and precise. If design could alter defense so quickly, then strategy had to be elastic and anticipatory rather than fixed. In the quiet after the noise, Captain James Carter wrote a short note and slid it into the glove compartment of his Mustang. It was addressed to the boy in the photograph and read, "We crossed what they thought we could and came home still breathing." He kept flying. He kept thinking about the small decisions that had saved lives and about the men who had watched the sky and told others what it now meant. Historians later quoted John Avery, a veteran strategist who wrote, "The marriage of power and efficiency in the P-51 changed the map of risk more than any single sortie.
It was not the plane so much as the idea that distance could no longer be counted on. That thought would echo in classrooms and in briefing rooms and in the private conversations of commanders. What remained after the smoke cleared was a simple question that kept resurfacing in letters and in command cables. If a machine built with better numbers could so quickly rewrite where danger lay, what would similar combinations do in the future? The final image was of a mechanic named Eddie Morales polishing a new propeller while a young pilot watched and asked about strategy. And the man answered, "You keep her fed and you keep your head," then smiled and went back to work. If you were in Captain James Carter's place, would you push further into the unknown or hold to the rules that had kept you safe for years? Tell us what you would do in the comments and consider subscribing for more stories about the moments when engineering changed the map of war.